Welcome back to At Lore's Edge, the channel where we discuss fantasy lore. Today we're going to be talking about the Gronti-Duraz, the runic golems created by the dwarves of old in the Warhammer fantasy universe. I was inspired to do this by a recent mod for Total War Warhammer 3 that brought the runic golems to life, and the modders did an awesome job, so I just want to give a shout out to them here, and the detail and link for that mod is going to be in the comments below. So thank you to them for inspiring me, and keep up all the great work. So jumping right into it, the Gronti-Duraz, or the runic golem. The Gronti-Duraz, the mighty golems fashioned at the dawn of the dwarf kind, the first said to have been shaped by Thungi himself, ancestor god of the runesmiths. First or last, they were marvels of magic, manifestations of what the Dawi had once been capable of. That was Ranald Silverthumb, one of the greatest rune lords of Karaz-a-Karak, who was active at and before the time of the War of the Beard. The Gronti-Duraz, or literally enduring mountain, in Khazalid, which is the language of the dwarves, were creations made by the dwarves, fashioned out of stone and metal, and then brought to life through runic magic. They were many feet tall, the size of giants, and although we don't have specific dimensions on them, as they've never been represented on tabletop or in lore specifically, we do know that they strode across the battlefield, taller than anything that the dwarves could muster themselves, and were clearly visible against the backdrop of the demonic armies that were being faced by the dwarves at the time of the first invasion of chaos. So, who created them? Per legend of the dwarves, the ancestor gods were the first to walk out of the mountains and found the dwarven race. These included famously Grungni and his wife Valea and his brother Grimnir. But the ancestor god of the runesmiths, who actually created the Gronti-Duraz, was Thungi, the son of Grungni and Valea. He's also famous for creating many of the greatest weapons the dwarves made, including the Galmaraz, the famous hammer of Sigmar, which has been carried over into the Age of Sigmar game, which is played currently in that system, and which also, of course, the Galmaraz featured famously in Warhammer Fantasy as well. But among his creations was the Gronti-Duraz. Now, how the dwarves created these creatures in the past but can't create them now is partly needed to understand how runic magic works. Magic in the Warhammer world is a free-flowing resource. It flows out of the polar gates at either end of the Warhammer world and flows throughout the world almost like wind, or like a current of water, except through the air. There's 8 winds of magic, but that's really not important to the dwarves. The dwarves harness the raw winds of magic, and rather than use them in their raw form like humans or elves do, or the Slann, they put them into runic shapes. And once these runic shapes are saturated with magic, they can then be called upon. Now, the runes will eventually run out of magic, depending on the amount of power used by that rune. Sometimes a rune is fairly weak, like a rune of light for a lantern that all its job is to do is to cast a glow. Or maybe a rune of cleaving, where its only job is to make an axe sharper. But other times, like a rune of waking, such as the type used for the Gronti-Duraz, it's so powerful and uses so much magic that there isn't enough magic in the world anymore to use them. And this is because at the time of Thungi and the time of the ancestor gods, there was much, much more magic in the world. The old ones who landed in the Warhammer universe in ancient times and then used magic to forge the world into the shape that it is now, had created vast polar gates, as they're called, to allow untold amounts of magic into the world for the purpose of building. Essentially, they and the Slann would use magic to shape the world in any way they wanted, to create land masses, to create entire races of beings, to destroy races of beings, to do whatever really they wanted to do. But then the great cataclysm happened. The polar gates were destroyed, and when they were destroyed, the old ones disappeared, and magic went rampant. It's rather than being not allowed in the world at all, it was simply uncontrolled. It's almost as if a dam had broke, and now all magic was just flowing over the world. This led to the Great Cataclysm, where chaos was running rampant in the first great invasion of chaos. That'll be a whole separate lore video, but essentially, during this time period, there was so much magic that the runesmiths of old could create works of art that have been unsurpassed in the present day. Grungni was able to create the Anvils of Doom. Thungi could create weapons of untold power, and the Gronti-Duraz, of course, were his greatest creations, the giants that strode across the battlefield with a life of their own, in their hundreds, not just one or two, but hundreds of them. But then the elves, in their being party poopers that they are, siphoned the magic of the world off in the Great Vortex. And that's how it's been since then, until the end times. Now, the Gronti-Duraz weren't mentioned in the end times, so it's unlikely that they can, while they could have possibly been repowered, since the magic was available, there might not have been the learning left to do that. But, because I'm getting ahead of myself, at the time of the War of the Beard, when Ranald Silverthumb recorded the quote from earlier in this book, or earlier in this presentation, the Gronti-Duraz simply didn't have enough power left in any of their runes and any of the existing dwarves left to repower themselves. Certainly not even one, certainly not hundreds. And that was because the elves were literally siphoning off all of the magic in the world to prevent chaos from really gaining the foothold that it once had. Which, while it's great for the world itself, made the dwarves feel as if they were less powerful, simply because they couldn't emulate the works of their ancestors. They took this culturally as a sign that they were weaker than they were in the past, they were less skilled, when in reality it was a failing on their part to understand how magic works, and that they simply didn't have as much magic, as much raw material as they once did. Maybe had they understood that magic was, in the same way as gromrail or iron, simply a finite resource that was no longer available, maybe their culture would have turned out a little bit different. So what did the Gronti-Duraz look like when they were in their prime? Well, we really don't know, besides being big and made of stone and metal and bearing runes. Many different iterations have come up, none of which, incidentally, from Games Workshop, but they've come up from different companies. We've seen an example from the world of Skyrim and Elder Scrolls, from the Dwarven Centurions, and then, of course, the most excellent example that I've seen, which is the Total War mod that started this, that inspired this video. I think this model is absolutely perfect. In all honesty, if Games Workshop were to just go ahead and take this one and use it, I think that would be a great way to do it. I like the use of the Throne of Power on the back here, the runic staff, and then of course the various runic pieces. That would have definitely been very thematic for the dwarves. As it stands, the only kind of evidence that we have of what they might have looked like are the runic guardians that we know from the Warhammer roleplay series. Now, runic guardians are a scaled down ogre size runic creation, and they're also mechanical. So in the place of the vast runic magic that brought stone and metal to life, the rune lords of the time of woe, so after the War of the Beard, during the Goblin Wars, when holds were falling left and right, and the dwarves needed to abandon their holds but wanted to protect their ancestors, they would activate, the runesmiths combined themselves with the Engineers Guild, which was practically blasphemy at the time, and created these runic guardians that could be awakened to protect the sacred places of their ancestors when the living dwarves were all gone. And this is what they look like, since they are still some to extent existing today. With that being said, this is our only example. It's obviously an artistic version, and the dwarves being highly artistic themselves, it's unlikely that all of them looked the same way. Just the same way it's highly unlikely that Thungi would have made all of the runic golems looking the same way. He would have gotten bored making the same the same artifact over and over again. So it's fully possible that even though these are all different companies, the Gronti-Duraz would have looked more like this collection of various different models than it would have looked like all one model, even as perfect as I think that this mod turned out to be. So the big question for gamers, will they show up in the Warhammer the Old World? Unfortunately, Probably not. And this is just a storyline lore perspective. There's no evidence that the winds of magic blew as strong, especially strong, during the Asvar Kull invasion of chaos, the Great Invasion of Chaos of 2302. The greatest winds of magic were during the Great Cataclysm, when the Gronti-Duraz were created and were available on the battlefield for the dwarves. But after that, the next great times of chaos, of magic that we have, were the Storm of Magic that directly preceded the End Times, and then the End Times itself, when the Great Vortex was disassembled. During those two times, magic strode across the world, and we did get great necromantic constructions of golems, such as the Necrofex Colossus, and Khemri was able to animate the Khemric Titans, but Games Workshop made it very clear that there was no runic golems. That says to me that despite all the magic that was available, even at those great times of the world, it still was either the learning wasn't there or the magic wasn't there to create the Gronti-Duraz again. And they existed. They weren't there at the time. They existed in a lore, and they weren't put on the tabletop, and there was definitely a hankering for them. Dwarves were very underpowered at this time in the game, and it would have been a great addition to the table. So I'm going to go on a limb and say no, they are probably not going to show up. That said, Games Workshop, if you're listening to my show, and you're one of, my 100 viewers or so, please prove me wrong. I would love you to prove me wrong. I would love to play with some Gronti-Duraz on the table. And with that, please let me know, what do you think? Put your comments below, maybe get a discussion around this, and let's tag Games Workshop as many times as possible and see if they throw the Gronti-Duraz back on the table for us, or maybe even if CA puts an official Gronti-Duraz in the game itself so that it's fully supported. Thank you again for tuning in. Please click like and subscribe. I really want to get this channel off the ground, and I also want to make myself better, so any suggestions, even if they sound a little mean to you, I appreciate. Thank you for tuning in again, and you have a great day.